Yeah, hello everyone. We're waiting for people to keep coming in, so we'll wait a couple of more minutes for others to join before we start. In the meantime, if you would like to say hello in the chat, where are you joining us from? Yeah, feel free to do so. Okay, I might get started and other people can join in the meantime. So hello, welcome everyone. Welcome to our 5th session of this year's EUC Seminar Series, Aim High Degrow, Dialogues on Degrowth. We had to have a small pause, but we're back now. We invite you to visit our website where you can catch up on our first 4 sessions and also register for our final session in June. Today, we're going to delve into the role of the state in a degrowth future. We are very excited to have Milena Buchs here with us, who is a professor of sustainable welfare at the Sustainability Research Institute at the University of Leeds in the UK. Milena's research focuses on sustainable welfare and just transitions. She has published widely on the relationship between economic growth and welfare states, and is currently the co-I of the Horizon Europe funded project towards a sustainable well-being economy. We are also very excited to have Max Koch with us, who is a professor of social policy and sustainability at Lund University. The ongoing theme of his research has been the ways in which capitalist restructuring impacts the environment, welfare, well-being, and the social structure. Currently, he is a PI in the interdisciplinary project Post-Growth Welfare Systems, and is a researcher in the Flywell project and finishing the book Deep Transformations, A Theory of Degrowth. This session today will be moderated by my colleague Stefan Kipfer, who is a professor here at EUC, whose research is focused on urban politics, urbanization and planning in transnational and comparative contexts. Okay, a couple of reminders for everyone before I pass on to Stefan to kick off the session. The chat is open for comments and respectful dialogue. Don't write your questions there, though. For questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can click on the thumbs up to upvote questions that interest you, and that will help our moderator to prioritize during the discussion part. A recording of the session will be available on our website, so you can watch it again or share it with friends and colleagues that might be interested. And we're also collecting notes from the chat and the Q&A, and these will be posted on our website as well as a resource for afterwards. Okay, let's get started. Over to you, Stefan.
Thanks very much, Lena, for the introduction and for organizing the whole series, for inviting me to this particular session. I will do what other moderators have done before, which is to begin with the York University land acknowledgement and speak to it a bit in relationship to the session today. The York University land acknowledgement, which was developed a few years ago with the help of our indigenous colleagues here, reads as follows. York University recognizes that many indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University itself. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many indigenous nations. The area known as Takaronto has been taken care by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is also subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Now, what to do with land acknowledgements? For those of you who join us from beyond Turtle Island, which is to say North America in some indigenous languages, this is a question that many have asked since land acknowledgements have become part of the institutional landscape here a few years ago. They represent symbolic concessions to a resurgent indigenous set of movements that have been very active over the last 15 years. But as some indigenous colleagues like Hayden King have said, land acknowledgements are also easily just performative and perfunctory. For these acknowledgements to mean something, they must lead people, including settler folks like myself, to push beyond the acknowledgements themselves, to engage in action, solidarity, and learning. On the last point, learning, land acknowledgements remind us that in these lands, capitalist states still have a colonial core. Built on a colonial relation between indigenous nations and the rest of us, they are not post-colonial. And this becomes clear when we contemplate key terms mentioned by the York University land acknowledgement: territory, land, and treaty. Land acknowledgements want us to consider the manifold, dynamic, and ongoing indigenous traditions within which treaty, land, and territory, for example, are typically considered as fluid, open-ended, differentiated, and reciprocal relations between humans and non-humans. These conceptions are qualitatively different from three elementary foundations of the modern capitalist state form. First, the state-enforced practice of land as private property, which is to say an object cut into homogeneous and fenced parcels ready for sale as real estate. Second, the conception of territory as a bordered, uniform, and hierarchical form of space produced by empires and nation states. And finally, the idea of treaty as a technical agreement between states, understood as hierarchical and permanent concentrations of power, rule, and violence. Permanent concentrations of power that are alienated from their subjects and governed by ruling class networks oriented towards a variety of expansionary, growth-oriented imperatives. For our purposes today, then, we can say that in settler colonial societies, to consider degrowth and the state cannot help but tackle decolonization as a fundamental, manifold, and also material strategic problem. This concerns not only Canada and the United States on Turtle Island, but also other settler states in the Americas, in Australia and New Zealand, and I should say, crucially in our current context, Israel. Now, without further ado, let's move into the presentations. We have a tight agenda, and we've decided that Milena Buchs will start with Oh, I'm sorry. No, apologies. Max Koch will start us off with his presentation. After which Milena will follow. Each speaker will have 10 minutes to speak, and after the two speakers are finished, we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So, Max, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I'll share my presentation. So the introduction by Stefan is, I think, also a further proof that states are not kind of innocent entities in many ways, and they haven't been especially popular in degrowth discourse either. I remember very well an international degrowth conference in Malmö in 2018, which I co-organized, where we had passionate debates about how we should see the state within this movement. There are some contradictions here, which can be seen as a bit of the background to my own work about it. So on the one hand, degrowth circles have tended to view states as part of the problem rather than the solution to the kind of ecological and social transformation we will all want to see. On the other hand, Kosman and others were the first to demonstrate that actually the most degrowth policy proposals that have been tabled are rather, or presuppose, rather traditional top-down state regulation. So the contradiction is then between conceptualizing the state on the one hand as an external power incapable of initiating change in an ecological and social direction, and on the other hand, politically appealing to it to do precisely this. And after this conferences, I went back to some classics of state theory and started to think about whether this kind of contradiction can maybe be overcome by, in a sense, that we maybe actually use the state to bring about the changes we want to see, and of course, without being too naive about it, and without forgetting of all the co-optation experiences that various movements have experienced. And I looked at Gramsci, Poulantzas, and Bourdieu. I don't think I have the time to go into the context in the detail, but if you have questions later on, I will try my best to answer them. What the three have in common is that they assume a rather multi-layered entanglement between states and civil society that makes it actually difficult to separate, and as I will argue in the conclusion, also for organization and mobilization purposes, it's very difficult to be active only at the side of civil society and not on the state, and vice versa. So I've then basically written two papers on the topic. In one, I've been basically toying with the idea of what is actually the state doing in capitalist growth economy and what it may be doing in post-growth circumstances. I can dedicate maybe 3 or 4 minutes to that. So
Max, sorry, just do you mind putting full screen so we can see the table bigger?
What's that? All right, I could go to slideshow maybe if this is possible. But it doesn't seem to.
There.
Oh, yeah.
If you click,
now it works.
perfect.
Is it a bit better now?
Perfect.
All
Thank
right,
you.
okay. So this is basically an idea of how to conceptualize what the state is doing in capitalist growth economies. I'm looking at economic development, state spatiality, and policies, basically. So in capitalism, economic development is in the first place seen as expansion of, well, the economic scale measured in monetary growth, in Marxist terms, exchange value orientation rather than use value orientation. And then you have the various roles that the state plays there. On the first one, almost every political economist is in agreement from, I would almost say, from Marx to Milton Friedman. People agree that in order to exchange commodities, you need a kind of third institution that is not part of the exchange operation, that guarantees private property, the principle of equivalence, and the legal security of economic subjects. Much less agreement is already the case when we look at the second role, which is the welfare state. So if Marx showed that capitalism has the tendency to commodify social relations, and people like Esping Anderson and others have shown that welfare states tend to decommodify these relations again and allow some people to live basically without having to sell the labor power. And then there's finally, in the last 30 years or so, also the environmental state, which addresses problems of externalization of environmental costs. And then we can look at the kind of spatial target, as the geographer Brenner would call it, which is basically the territory or the scale where states are usually active. This is a delicate structure which is always subject to de- and rescaling processes. When new kind of scales become prominent and others lose in prominence, and for Europe and I guess also Northern America, the national level was most important here. And then we have policies that are made within what Hausknost calls the glass ceiling of producing economic growth. So social policies may, for example, de- or recommodify the labor power, and environmental policies are meant to produce green growth via, for example, carbon taxation or carbon markets. Then in this first paper, I started fantasizing a little bit what the state could actually do if we would do it, and if we were strong enough to do it. Again, we could look at the three things: economic development, spatial target, and economic and eco-social policies. The economic development, as every ecological economist could tell you, should be seen as a biophysical process, rather use value orientation than exchange orientations. States should ensure that production and consumption patterns do not exceed environmental limits or planetary boundaries. It should define limits for economic and social inequality, and it should steer new governance networks of state, collective, communal, and private property forms and actors. The spatial target would change to some extent, as the global and local levels would be most important and relevant. It is at the global level where we would need to define or identify thresholds for matter and energy throughput, which would basically define the leeways within which national and local economies could actually evolve. And that would be done by a range of eco-social policies. I don't think I have the time to discuss some of them, but basically, if you think of the donut model, for example, they would be designed to orient production and consumption patterns that we have towards a safe and just operating space. It would be oriented at environmental or planetary ceilings on the one hand, but also make sure that there are social flaws that people can actually satisfy their basic needs. Well, this, of course, presupposes a range of things that we not seeing, at least not enough. It would presuppose civil society mobilization, self-transformation of state employees, and the expansion of what Bourdieu calls the left hand of the state, no? Which is traditionally the welfare state, you could say the environmental state, as opposed to the repressive side of it, which students these days feel very, very clearly. Sorry. Just today, the Palestina encampment in Lund University was cleared. So I just come to the end. I don't think I have much time. I think if you look at these classics of state theory, and you could take others, of course, but if you take Gramsci, Poulantzas, and Bourdieu, you find that states and civil societies are actually difficult to separate these days. And if you think about Poulantzas, just to take one example, he had this idea, but what the state does, its concrete policies, it is a condensation, a condensed expression of what is going on in the wider societies. So in principle, if the societal power could be mobilized from below, it could impact on state policies. And maybe the historical examples of the welfare state, however much we may criticize, is an example that, in this case, changed class relations can make an impact, can have an impact on concrete class policies. I think that due to these structural entanglements of civil society and the state, degrowth and allied movements have no alternative but to mobilize in a range of civil society fields and at the same time try to occupy strategic positions within the state to initiate social ecological transformation. So we need both civil society and state engagement. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Max. That was very insightful. Milena, I think you're going to jump right in there, following up from these remarks.
Great. Yes. Thanks very much. And I think that hopefully will work really well because Max has, set the theoretical scene really, really well, and our work is quite influenced by Max's works on the role of the state. So, yeah, hi everyone. Thank you for joining, and thank you again to everyone who organized this seminar or webinar, because I will talk about some of the drivers and challenges that state-led post-growth initiatives are experiencing. So, this all speaks to this overall question about, can the state play a role in the transition towards degrowth? So I will briefly recap some of these theoretical arguments. Max has done this much better already than myself. And then I will report some first, and I really have to highlight, preliminary findings from our Horizon Europe project that looks at transformation towards, we call it in the project well-being economies, but we could also call it post-growth economies. I think, these terms, in this particular context, I think I use them quite interchangeably. So very briefly then, sort of the question, can and should the state play a role in the degrowth transition? The literature, as Max says, really features both pro and contra arguments. There's an important normative argument against this position, which is an anarchist argument, which says, well, the state perpetuates hierarchical power relationships, and therefore the state should actually be abolished altogether. If we are moving away from capitalism and towards post-growth, then that would imply, abolishing the state. That's the sort of anarchist position. A structural Marxist position looks at it from the perspective of, where can the state actually play a role, and concludes that it can't, because capitalism and the state have co-evolved. And so therefore the main function of the state is actually to maintain a capitalist growth-based economy. And for that reason, from that perspective, the state cannot play a role in this transition. But as Max has also explained, there are several pro-arguments that say, well, we need the state in this transition because there's no actor on their own who can lead this transition. So civil society actors, grassroots initiatives, and so on, they don't have the capacity on their own to lead this transition. Everyone needs to be involved: businesses, individuals, state, civil society, etc. The state is also not completely controlled by forces that favor growth-based capitalism. You know, there's this left and right hand within the state. There are conflicts between different state departments, etc. And that's a potential way in for alternative approaches. The state also crucially depends on public support. It needs to be seen, you know, to be legitimate. And so, therefore, the state needs to represent and to some extent at least address the interests of those who are dominated. And again, that can be a way in for alternative approaches. And then finally, the alignment of, you could maybe call it, power constellations within the state is never completely stable. They are always in flux, and that means that crises, either internal crises within governments or external crises, economic crisis, climate change, emergency, etc., they can destabilize these sorts of constellations as well, and again, open up windows of opportunity. And I think this is also where civil society organizations become quite important, because that can be the way in for them to make their positions heard and become more influential. So in the To Be project, which is this Horizon Europe project led by the University of Tampere, in our work package, we look at how does transformative change happen. So we assume we know what needs to happen. We have talked about this for years and decades, probably even. What we need to understand now is how can this change happen? We look at alternative economic approaches that are implemented in the global north and global south. So, for example, we look at things like the well-being economy governments or donut economic cities, and so on, to see how do they function, how do they work, what sort of barriers and enablers do they experience. So far, we've done a long list, we call it, of 34 semi-structured interviews with representatives from public administrations that have implemented such initiatives. In this phase, so that was a sort of first broad phase where we looked at initiatives across a range of different European and global North countries. We even included some green growth initiatives just to have the comparison. And we looked at initiatives at different levels, so national government, subnational government, and city level. And Laura Angresios and Alessia Gresselin and myself have done the interviews. I think Laura might actually be in the audience as well. So, you know, you can jump in as well later for answers to questions as well. And so following on from this, we will select hopefully a couple of cases for more in-depth study. And so what we've done in this first phase is to basically see, well, what is the evidence so far for these arguments that we've just heard, especially these sort of pro-arguments that the state can play a role. So first of all, there is quite a lot of evidence that states are pluralistic. They are these sort of helpers from within. So, you know, teams, departments that have initiated or implemented alternative economic approaches are actually often on the side of post-growth. They say they believe in post-growth. They are very convinced by the arguments, and often quite senior people have actually led these sorts of initiatives. Role of crisis, again, there's a lot of evidence that many of these initiatives have been set up in response to some kind of crisis. That can sometimes be a combination of crisis within the government, like a change in government, some scandals within the government, you know, things that they've been doing not working out. They lost trust with citizens and so on. So they are looking for new solutions, for new ways of doing things. And this is often where then the idea comes up, oh, let's set up, you know, a donut economics initiative or a well-being economy initiative or something similar that works along similar lines, but maybe isn't called that way. There's also plenty of evidence that the relationship between the public administration and civil society is really important. So several say that civil society actors are very important in their sort of broader network for implementing the initiative. And in the green quote, for example, that's an interesting one where a civil servant has gone about and actually set up a strategic group of citizens and advocacy organizations to put pressure on the government to, they say here, ultimately pass this type of legislation, by which they mean a type of legislation that is very crucial in this sort of well-being economy context, and supports, you know, the well-being economy. So yeah, so the state has actively tried to organize some pressure from civil society organizations. I should, however, also say, and there's not a quote on this slide, but we have also learned that sometimes relationships between these state-led initiatives and grassroots organizations can be quite fraught. They can be, you know, seen as not radical enough, and so that can create friction and sometimes also problems for the initiative. So having said all this, there are a lot of remaining challenges for realizing post-growth initiatives. The growth position remains very hegemonic, even in initiatives that have adopted well-being economy frameworks or donor economic frameworks. So, you know, even like within the same government, there are often then teams who are not convinced of all of these arguments. And the minute someone from the team that implements the initiative tries to talk to them in post-growth terms, kind of the conversation stops. Or if they have multi-criteria frameworks, sort of indicator frameworks, GDP quite often, A remains to be there, but also often remains to be dominant. So this is very tricky. Then we have a range of other challenges, which I just really quickly whiz through. We have quotes for all of those. So short-term policy cycles, siloed policy making, that remains to be the case, but this is exactly what we need to move away from. Often the people involved in these initiatives struggle with the multitude of alternative approaches that are already being presented to them. So, you know, there have been beyond GDP approaches. There have been the sustainable development goals. Now there are these well-being economy and donor economics frameworks. And civil servants go like, why do we need yet another framework? What does it mean? How does it relate to other frameworks? So that creates some confusion, I think, and sometimes waters down the more radical approaches. Then very clearly, I think we are talking here about very different ways of making decisions, very different ways of policy making. If you go down the post-growth and degrowth route, because it means you have to look at a multiple criteria. But doing this takes much more energy and time and so on, and that is often not available. So there's often a lack of resources for people working within these administrations to even, you know, implement at a very basic level these types of frameworks that we are talking about. And then we heard a lot from several people, well, we here in public administrations, we generally resist change. You know, we look at stability and so on. We are not really in the business of, of radical change. If anything, then maybe incremental change, but nothing too radical. So yeah, so this is what we, so this is sort of where we are at the moment. So I think we're still, despite all these barriers and challenges, still interested in exploring this question about what the role of the state can be. I think there can be a role. It just seems to be very slow and incremental. And so far, none of the initiatives that we looked at fully meets post-growth criteria, and that aligns with previous literature on this. And that also means that, unfortunately, the growth position very much remains to be hegemonic. So in the future case study work, we want to look in more detail at, what kind of strategies, what kind of actor constellations, i.e. state and civil society, for example, together, how can they contribute to destabilizing the hegemonic growth position? And I leave it here. Thanks very much. And I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thanks so much, Milena. Thanks, both of you, Max and Milena. Now we have about 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes maximum for discussion. Let me just check what the situation here is. Okay, so we have 4 questions in the Q&A. So just a prompt to the audience. Don't hesitate adding questions to the Q&A list, please. We will be selecting from those. Can I perhaps just ask a couple of questions of clarification to each of you, one to each of you, Max and Milena, just to kind of bridge all of that. Max, very quickly, and I think this is a bit of a follow-up question that you almost asked for regarding your starting point and your conclusion, which is centered on the works of Antonio Gramsci, of Nikos Poulantzas, and Bourdieu. Could you give us a bit of a sense of where you stand on the long-standing debates that have been happening on any of those 3, particularly the first 2, Gramsci and Poulantzas, both of which are, oriented towards a communist perspective, both of which have engaged critically with Lenin's tradition, have tried to criticize it and develop it at once, etc. Anyway, I'm just introducing this. Lots of debate. You seem to have a particular set of entry point into these authors, and maybe you could kind of elaborate on that a little bit. Milena, this is very much a related question, but on the empirical side for you. In your preliminary conclusions, you kind of have 2 endpoints. You start saying, well, our research seems to indicate that, states, are not unified, are not singular in terms of their internal organization. They incorporate multiple forces. You called them pluralistic, even in one instance. At the same time, one of your main conclusions is to say that, well, the growth imperative, the capitalist growth imperative remains hegemonic. And so could you perhaps elaborate a bit on how you would bring together those 2 statements? Are they really contradictory, or, how would you, perhaps also drawing on Poulantzas and Gramsci, others, consider them to be, in fact, 2 sides of the same coin? Or not, depending on where you come from. So back to you, Max and Milena.
Yeah, I can start. I don't expect anyone to be familiar with my work to some extent, but I have actually been trying for a while, actually going back to my doctoral thesis in the 1990s to kind of marry a kind of unorthodox Marxist position with a Bourdieusian approach. So while I've done that on class relations before, and later on also on some other things. I know that Poulantzas and Bourdieu were in the 1970s. There were, of course, more antipodes than on the same side in many ways, but I don't think this must be necessarily the case. So I think the Marxist tradition is very good when it comes to understand the structural imperatives that we have in a capitalist political economy. In relation to what states can and sometimes must do. But the Bourdieusian view on it is I kind of like it because it's a bit of a more micro-sociological view in many ways, because it's also more empirically grounded in many ways, because you understand how state power is actually felt in day-to-day life. And this starts with, Bourdieu makes this example for example, schedules that everyone takes, you know, when work starts, when the trains go, etc., etc., what you follow, all this. And he says this is going back in the end, at the end of the day, to state power. The state is itself a social field like all the others, but with a certain extra power, he says, that which is basically to kind of define the division of labor between all the other fields. And I think this is potentially productive to see these things together that are often seen as antipodes.
All right, thank you very much, Max, for the clarification. Milena.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much for the question. So I would see these two positions as two sides of the same coin. I think they go together. So on the one hand, you know, we do have different positions within the state. It's not a monolithic block of interests. But within this, of course, certain groupings can be more dominant than others. So yeah, so, you know, I think what we are seeing here is that, for example, let's say in a donor economics case, maybe the sustainability department is leading on this within a municipality, but then they have a range of other departments that they have to interact with. And, you know, even though maybe the whole municipality is called a donor economic city, it doesn't necessarily mean that all the departments are actually working according to that framework. So it is actually then in actual fact still a minority position within this municipality, if not all of the departments have adopted that framework, right? And yeah, so that's probably how I would see it. I think what is an interesting question is to think about, you know, I think where some of these arguments, for example, by Gramsci, for example, I know probably a little bit better than Bourdieu and Poulantzas, but where this argument comes from, that the state needs to be legitimate. And so this is where the state can open itself up for alternative interests. But I think what would be interesting to look at the moment is what policymakers think about, what citizens expect, and what is acceptable or not. So I find it fascinating sometimes, you know, frustrating, but also fascinating, how policymakers often limit themselves because they believe that certain more radical positions would not fly well with the electorate. So that is an interesting phenomenon that we see at the moment, I think, where states almost limit themselves, even though, you know, the legitimacy thing, which according to the theory should open them up for more transformative action, actually doesn't. Yeah.
Right.
So yeah, so where is that coming from? What is the role of media here, etc.? Is all a very interesting question, I think.
Right. Yes, thank you, Milena. So let me just now propose a few things about the questions and answers. I'm not sure if I can bring Lena back into this. Is that possible?
Yes, I'm here.
Because you have the kind of the long vision and from all the sessions, which I think the rest of us don't. And I was wondering, after I get back to Max and Milena, because there's a number of questions that are clearly specific to them, I was wondering if you could ruminate a bit about two of them that might have been partly addressed in other sessions. And it might be useful for some audience members to know about that, if that's the case. And Lena, I'm thinking here specifically about the first and the third question on the list. So the anonymous one that came in first. So what is the degrowth from Black environmental disabilities, violence, etc.? And then the third one, which partly, I guess, picks up from the land acknowledgement. You know, is there an indigenous scholars debate about degrowth? We had a session on the post-colonial and the colonial question a number of months ago, and I unfortunately did not attend that session, but there may be something, Lena, that you could tell us from that. But I'll let you think about it for the moment and get back to the panelists. So, and then if you want, you can maybe weigh in after the next round. In terms of the questions, I think we have two questions that work well together, Max and Milena, and I will leave it up to you how to respond to that one. Vlad and Catherine both ask, you have the questions in front of you, right? You can see those? Okay, so Vlad and Catherine both ask questions about time. And they both ask, do we have time for two different things? Do we have time for incremental and slow change? And do we have the capacity to do everything radical right now? It's kind of an interesting way of framing the question. In a sense, we put them both together. So I was wondering if you could kind of speak to the temporal aspect, given that we are in fact living in an accelerating situation of climate crisis. The second question, which has a lot of votes, which I may want to also give back to you immediately for your consideration, Max and Milena, and I'll leave it up to you if you want to respond to that one, is the one by Judith, who got a number of raised hands there. And she asks, I'm wondering if we should maybe differentiate between the policymaking state and the repressive state. The policymaking state may or may not be open to degrowth reforms, yet the repressive state tries to keep down the climate justice movement with a lot of force and sometimes violence. In Turtle Island, in France, and in Germany, even invoking anti-terror law. So maybe you could speak to that fundamental question, right? Given that states are supposedly garnering the monopoly of legitimate state violence, right? So legitimate physical violence. So anyway, Max and Milena, back to you. The time question and the repressive question, your pick. Maybe Max, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I can try. Yes. Well, okay, I can try the second one about the policy making state and the repressive state. Yes, all these theorists we mentioned, and I think Milena and I, and possibly also Stefan, we would agree that it is the state as we have it at the moment is a unity of both of it. Maybe with a tendency towards the repressive element at the moment, but this, as Milena has pointed out, also empirically, this is changing, and the state is not a kind of a monolith where the repressive apparatus is set in stone to dominate forever. That was basically much of the the point of departure of the three theorists' work that I have mentioned. That we also have a civil society, and we also have a welfare state, and we have an environmental state, and all these things didn't come out of the blue. They were introduced as a matter of social struggles, of mobilizing. Historically, that had more to do with the working class. It would probably need to be a kind of different movement now, but in principle, I would say it is possible and absolutely necessary to influence from the outside, but also from the inside. If you think about it, as university teachers, we are also part of the state apparatus, unless you work in the private university, of course. But to some extent, we are also part of it, and we are also taking part in the struggles between the left hand and the right hand of the state, and how successful we are with this in this struggle has a lot to do with the first question of time, I think, which I think Milena can answer well.
Thank you, Max. I'm not sure I can answer it well, but yeah, because it is a an important question, but also a really tricky question, which I'm struggling with myself, I have to say, because yes, I think we experience the acceleration of climate change on a daily basis, and everything feels very, very, very urgent. But at the same time, I hesitate to say this almost, because it sounds quite conservative, but I think we can't move faster than we can, because that would be undemocratic. So we need to make sure that whatever happens is supported by citizens, that there is a broad consensus basis behind it, and so on. And these things don't happen overnight. We are talking about very complex and deep-reaching changes in how we think and how we make decisions and how we interact with people. And we see that reflected in these administrations that we're looking at there, right? So on the one hand, that can look frustrating because it feels like, why is there no government that says categorically we abolish GDP? But I actually now, I think I've come to the conclusion so far, at least, this is unlikely to happen, right? I think what we are seeing now is that, and I think actually this is also important, that we need to acknowledge that many, many governments absolutely agree with this argument that GDP in itself and growth in itself is not enough, right? They are aware that climate change, health, inequality, all these other things matter. It is a matter of prioritization, and in which situation, what is prioritized in which situation, basically. And so I think we are already seeing probably much more broadly a move away from just looking at GDP. This is not how policy making works either. But obviously we need much more of focus on ecological objectives and well-being and social objectives and so on, than is currently the case. So yeah. So I think it's finding out how these things can be promoted, and yes, accelerated, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Milena. Lena, would you like to say something about Black and Indigenous questions as they may or may not emerge in degrowth debates? Or anybody else for that matter, but I'm just, you have the kind of the overview of all the debates we've had so far.
Yeah, I can say something quickly. So just kind of as a bit of context, degrowth is rooted in sort of anti-colonial and anti-imperial solidarities with movements in the global south. So there's that element of solidarity. Now, strategic alliances between these are not as clear. And specifically, these types of alliances in settler states are even less clear. And what degrowth would look like in a settler state is not very much explored at all. So that's, it's a very, very much an open question. In the seminar series, we tried to start talking about it in the session that Stefan mentioned earlier. But yeah, definitely an open question in degrowth, and one that we should keep asking.
Mm-hmm. Max and Milena, do you have something to add to this, to Lena's point?
Not really, no, not from my side.
No? Okay. Well, I'm not a degrowth specialist, but I do remember talking to my colleague Ellie, who was part of that panel a few months ago, about that, and the degree to which degrowth debates have in fact taken on board questions of colonialism or not. And certainly from the point of view of Black and Indigenous politics, one thing certainly to remember is that there's no one single perspective coming from Black radical or Indigenous perspectives on anything. And certainly
maybe I can say something short. What we also here in Lund specifically, we have been working on this a little bit, around the organization of the Malmö conference. I'd like to mention the work by my colleagues Ekaterina Cherkovskaya and Ria Raphael, especially. So this idea of talking of a pluriverse of kind of roads. So I think we all agree that the West is the last, basically, that can come close to a role model here. That is clear. But I think we have made some progress in this dialogue in the recent years. Between global South approaches and global North, while it is of course true that degrowth itself developed in the global North, especially in Europe, I think. But we have come some way with that.
Mm. Maybe one reflection I can offer is that so we do have a global South team in the same work package. But interestingly, the case studies they picked are all grassroots-led initiatives, or mainly, let's say, grassroots-led initiatives. So it is an interesting pattern that is maybe emerging there, in terms of what is the relationship between civil society, grassroots organizations on the one hand, and the state on the other hand, and how does it compare between the global North and the global South?
Yeah. Okay, good. I think we're almost at the end of our time, but maybe we have time for one last provocative question, because there is one that I think I would like Max and Milena's answer to, which is the question by Jeremy. So given that, Milena said that the growth paradigm is still hegemonic, as she found in her research, Jeremy asks, well, are there any properties or characteristics of the current economic hegemony that are helpful or beneficial to society or the environment? So here's a challenge to the degrowth scholars. How would you respond to that question? Like, what's wrong with the current?
Yeah, that is an interesting one. Yeah, I guess we are very trained in finding the problems, because I think the big problem isn't it, that if we focus on growth and we focus on conventional cost-benefit analysis and whether we stay within the budget limit and so on, we just tend to make, or have made in the past, the wrong decisions. The value isn't, the resources that we need haven't been allocated in ways that benefit the environment and society. And that is what a post-growth or a well-being economy approach tries to change, to really say, well, we have to make these sorts of decisions within limits, but we do need to reallocate basically the resources from extraction and exploitation and so on towards actually making sure that we meet basic needs and that we improve the environment. So I struggle a little bit to see much that can benefit in the current structure, I'm afraid.
Right. Yes. Well, I mean, the question really just it gives you the chance to restate, the importance of the degrowth perspective, right? I mean, look at that.
I can say that what I think a lot of people in degrowth, but I guess not only there, are struggling with is to kind of maintain and the defensible developments of capitalist civilization, at least for the privileged people in the global North that we have seen. So there's been progress in human needs satisfaction, and life expectancy, and many others. Unfortunately, this has been done in the context of economic expansion. And well, I would say I would like to keep some of that, but we would need to redefine the context, as Milena perfectly well said. So not everything about the Western life is wrong, but the costs outweigh the benefits at the moment, and that would need to change.
Yes, and I didn't mean to say, I think I was very much focusing on the economic system there when I was talking about when I was giving the response to the question. Yeah, undoubtedly there are elements in our lives and institutions which deserve to be, well, maybe transformed to some extent, but which have positive elements. Democracy, for example, the division of power, we see that very clearly at the moment in many states. What happens if the divisions between legislators and those who implement and those who are in the jurisdiction, if these boundaries start to blur, we get authoritarian states, and that's obviously not what. Yeah, that's not what we want. But I think how we do democracy, there are many open questions as to how we can do that better. There's still room for improvement.
Right. Very good. Excellent. Well, I think on that note, we have in fact reached the end of our session. I'd like to thank the audience for participating, for being here. Thanks, of course, to Milena and Max for your profound insights and responses, for Lena for organizing everything, as well as thanks to Kelly, Anna, and Elaine for helping to run this series and today's session. Lena, I'm not sure if you wanted to say.
Yeah, no, that's everything. Just to close, thank everyone for your participation. Please, if you would like to join our last session, which is Degrowth, is it a naive or utopian? That will be an interesting session to close the whole series. So if you'd like to, please feel free to follow the QR on the screen or go to our website. And like I said, you can catch up on previous sessions there as well. Thank you everyone for coming, and to the panelists, and yeah, it's been great. Thank you.
And thanks for the moderation, Stefan. Thanks so much. And for the organization, Lena. And always good to see you, Milena.
Indeed, same to you all, and thank you, Lena and Stefan and Max and everyone who attended.
And everyone else.
Thanks for your questions.
Okay, have a good weekend, everyone.
Same.
Thank you. You too. Bye.
Bye.
Okay, most people are filing out.
Ellie, do you want to stop the recording?
Yes.